Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the 2022 Corruption in Ireland report, commissioned by DCU's Anti-Corruption Research Centre. I'm Michael Breen, co-director of the centre. And first of all, let me just say a few words about our distinguished speakers today. And I won't sort of introduce them one by one. We'll just do all the introductions now. And first of all, let me welcome our president, Daire Keogh. We're very honoured to have Daire Keogh today. Daire is a distinguished and widely published historian who has served as president of Dublin City University since 2020. And I think you'll agree that since this time, a lot has happened, and Daire has expertly steered us through the many challenges that universities around the world have faced in the last couple of years. Thank you, Daire, for your support of the Anti-Corruption Research Centre and for joining us today. Our next speaker then after Daire is James Hamilton, Chair of the Advisory Council Against Economic Crime and Corruption and former Director of Public Prosecutions. In 2010, James was elected president of the International Association of Prosecutors, and he has had a distinguished career in law and public policy. Most recently, he has chaired the Department of Justice's review into the anti-fraud and anti-corruption measures. And thank you, James, also for joining us today and for your leadership in the anti-corruption community in Ireland. After hearing from both of our main speakers, I'll deliver a very brief overview of the findings from our report, and then I'll pass you over to my colleague, Dr. Robert Gillanders of DCU's Business School, and also co-director of the Anti-Corruption Research Centre, and Robert will offer some concluding thoughts. So thank you very much, and now I will hand you over to Daire.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for that very warm welcome. Element of flattery there, I think, at the outset. I mean, the big thing about DCU is that we have a wonderful team, so it's my great honour to be in this seat and leading the team on. I'm delighted to welcome people this morning. It's a beautiful frosty morning here in Glasnevin. Everything looks so crisp. It's a great programme. I'm delighted to see the range of attendees around the room. We've got academics, obviously, civil servants, government, NGOs, and the media with us. Particularly like to welcome our guest speaker, James Hamilton, who Michael has introduced to us a minute ago. The Anti-Corruption Research Centre here at DCU ARC is a relatively new centre, but it's one that has members from across the universities, faculties and schools. It's the only research centre of its kind in Ireland dedicated to the study of corruption and most particularly anti-corruption interventions. I'm very proud of the new centre, and it's already making waves in terms of its publications, and today is a great example of that. So we're very, very proud of the centre. The members are engaged at a very high level. Rob, who'll speak to us later, serves on the Advisory Council Against Economic Crime and Corruption. It's one of the two academic leads, and Michael Breen, who opened proceedings, is Ireland's local research correspondent on corruption for an EU-wide network. I'm pleased to welcome the IRC's Ukrainian research scheme, which brought Dr. Elisa Zetkova to join ARC to work on a project which explores how corruption impacts Ukrainian women's participation in political activism there. Corruption, as we know, is a worldwide problem, and corruption levels in Ireland may be low, at least we tell ourselves, but there is no room for complacency in this regard at all. And the research of the centre shows how corruption and mistrust ruins people's lives and, I think, the social fabrics of our society. We can see indications, we say, from the United States about the impact of corruption on levels of compliance within COVID and the more deaths as a result of that. So there are real consequences of corruption. Again, corruption threatens democracy at a time all of us are aware about the kind of increased polarization across societies and the fragility of democracy in Europe and across the world. So I'm very kind of pleased to welcome the decision of the centre to commission this survey of Ireland's attitudes to corruption. And the findings point to real challenges for Ireland in terms of the health of our democracy, that this week we're celebrating the centenary of the foundation of the state, the discussion around the success or the failure of that. And the stability has been a feature of the state, but the findings demonstrate is that we're not immune to corruption, the impact of corruption and the impact of corruption on the security and stability of the state. It's interesting to see at a very high level in the survey that many respondents believe that corruption has in fact worsened in Ireland, which is very, very striking, and particularly in really contentious areas like planning. And in the middle of a housing crisis, you can imagine how attuned people are to sensitivities, corruption and misinformation there. So there are the questions around onboard planola, for instance, which really strike at the whole kind of planning process here for us. And equally clear, I think, in the report too, is that a non-negligible or not insignificant share of the population believe that it's justifiable to bribe a public official. I'm really shocked by that and very surprised. We can see too that the trust in our political parties is low. And I think too, within the rivalry between our departments, and with an election within the next 2 years, that kind of question about corruption around politicians is one which even establishment politicians are kind of resorting to in what I think in some ways is a very kind of unhealthy development. And again, the majority of people in Ireland believe that no political party is likely to implement meaningful reform in the area of corruption, which again raises a significant challenge to us. So at the outset, I'd just like to thank the authors that you've given the policymakers and the decision makers very significant food for thought, that the key message is for people to take their role as custodians of the public trust more seriously. And I suppose that applies to all of us who manage public resources and in positions of trust. So we don't need to look back in history or across the world to see what happens when public trust runs out. And that, what was it Warren Buffett said, it takes a career. Is it a lifetime to make a reputation, but a minute to lose it? So again, I'd like to thank our colleagues, to James Hamilton, our guest this morning, and to the co-directors who we meet later on, Michael Breen again, and Rob Gillanders. I'd like to thank the members of the Centre more broadly. This is very much a team effort. To Molly Brennan, Ciara Feely from the Business School, kind of Communications and Marketing, for producing this fine report for us, and of course to Red Sea for carrying out the survey. So thank you very much and welcome again, and I look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daire. I'd like to invite James now to pass things over to you.
Thank you very much, Daire. President Keogh, ladies and gentlemen, it was a great honour for me to be asked by Dr. Robert Gillanders to speak at the launch of this report by the DCU Anti-Corruption Research Centre, entitled Corruption in Ireland, Attitudes, Beliefs and Challenges. I am, as was already explained to you, Chair of the Advisory Council Against Economic Crime and Corruption, which was established earlier this year. A major task of the Council is to draft a strategy for combating economic crime and corruption, together with an accompanying action plan. The strategy and the action plan will then be submitted to the Minister for Justice and the Government. The Council's terms of reference also include the coordination of research and analysis, training, public education and awareness raising, and the promotion of best practice in relation to economic crime and corruption. The Council consists of members drawn from both public and private sectors, including the main state agencies which combat corruption, as well as business, the academic world, and the trade unions. The formulation of the strategy and action plan will include a process of public consultation. In order to fight an enemy, you have to understand it. Good information about corruption, its causes and effects, is vital. Knowing public attitudes to and understanding of corruption is equally necessary. The report, which is launched today, is an important contribution to that information. I congratulate its authors and I hope its conclusions will help our knowledge of how corruption is viewed in Ireland today by the public. Of course, perceptions may not always accord with reality. It should be the purpose of an anti-corruption strategy to devise effective means to prevent corruption and to reassure the public by safeguarding the integrity of our institutions. I believe this report will make a very valuable contribution to debate in Ireland and will be very valuable towards helping the work of the Advisory Council. And I hope it will have as wide a readership as possible. So I take great pleasure in launching this report, and I hope that it will be a very successful enterprise. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you for joining us today. And we really are looking forward to the work that the Advisory Council are undertaking, and the action plan that is being prepared, I think, is really important. So let me first take you through some of the key points in the report. I'm going to share my screen with you. Right, so what did we find then? Well, first of all, this slide is showing some of the key findings from the report, but before I take you through these, I'd just like to thank Red Sea for their work on the report. John Rogers and Ciara Clark in particular were very helpful in putting this together. I'd also like to thank the members of the Anti-Corruption Research Centre for their work on the survey as well. We had a very productive research workshop earlier this year where we discussed the survey, and the members helped us devise key questions. I think the survey addresses an important gap in what we know and what we don't know about corruption in Ireland. There are a number of surveys out there like the Eurobarometer and Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. But they don't provide us with all the information that we need to really understand the nature of corruption in Ireland. So this is where our survey comes in. We look at things that aren't typically captured on the major international benchmarks, like the relationship between politics and business and planning, and more detailed granular issues to do with how people in Ireland perceive corruption. So the survey is a nationally representative survey of about 1,000 individuals. Work is proceeding to understand the survey in more detail. The report gives a snapshot of our findings, but we're doing further research to unpack those findings. In particular, we're trying to understand, what is driving some of these headline findings? What kind of socioeconomic variables and socio-demographic variables are driving the attitudes that we see? But let me take you through a few of the key results first. I mean, something that jumped out of the survey is that Irish people really want accountability, that most Irish people have little tolerance for corruption, and they want to hold their elected representatives to a very high level of accountability. The vast majority of them claim that they will punish politicians at the ballot box, if they're found to be corrupt. There was also a substantial module in our survey that looked at political connections and the connections between politics and business. And out of this module, we found that people really view having political connections as an advantage for business success. And that shouldn't be the case really in any country. And there's also a perception that public appointments are not necessarily given to those who deserve them based on merit alone. Despite that, there is a sizable proportion of the population that are in the middle, and they are uncertain about corruption in Ireland, or they're more optimistic. So, their attitudes can be shaped by events in the media or ministerial resignations or scandals. Some of these events may be leading more of the electorate to not give the government the benefit of the doubt without condemning them outright. So there is diversity in our findings, but the headline finding really is that people think we're moving in the wrong direction. Irish people see little evidence that corruption has improved in recent years across the pillars of our society, and with a larger proportion expressing the concern that things have gotten worse. In fact, 2/3 of the population would find a candidate running on an anti-corruption platform appealing. Now, when we dig into some of the other headline findings that behind this, let's look at the police, for example. A substantial number of Irish people think in the last few years, Garda standards have gotten worse. That's 35% are in the net worse category there, as opposed to 25% who think things have gotten better. And, indeed, there have been a number of scandals in the media related to An Garda Síochána, but, also there are efforts to reform the guards underway as well. Worryingly, people think that since the Celtic Tiger era, standards in public office have gotten worse, and that's a very large chunk of the population, 44%, see things getting much worse, as opposed to 22% seeing things getting better. And that's also the case for how people perceive things changing after the onset of COVID-19. 42% of people think that, corruption in Ireland has gotten worse after COVID-19, as opposed to 8% of people who think that things have gotten better. So it's a worrying trend. Of course, this kind of trend is probably present in many other countries too. A long-term decline in trust in politics, politicians, and beliefs about whether or not they're acting in the public interest. We can find that in other countries too, and Ireland is certainly no exception. And corruption and recent events like COVID has worsened things. Now, if we actually look at the attitudes to specific political parties and public standards and so on, we have some interesting findings here. When the electorate say things have gotten worse, are they talking about anyone in particular? Well, when we just ask our respondents, well, is this political party corrupt? At least almost half of people say that is the case with Fine Gael, and just over half of people say that is the case with Fianna Fáil. So, the main government parties have, a very poor image among a large, number of people in the electorate. And there's some distance between the governing parties and Sinn Féin. 36% of people, perceive that Sinn Féin is a corrupt party. And then, after Sinn Féin, you have the Greens and Labour and the Social Democrats at lower levels of perceived corruption. So it's interesting to look into the minds of a national survey and see that pattern. And we see interesting findings also in relation to the political parties about which parties hold themselves to a high standard of accountability and which parties are trustworthy. Sinn Féin, actually, among the Irish electorate, is considered, to hold themselves to the higher standard of accountability and to be the most trustworthy party in Ireland. Now, saying that, only 18% of the electorate hold this belief. So despite Sinn Féin, being the most trusted, it's still a very low level of trust. The base level is very low, and it's really a worrying trend for our democracy that this is the case. Again, more people think that Sinn Féin put the public good ahead of their own election interests at 21%, but still 21% is very low. And so they're the patterns we're seeing in terms of political parties and trust. There's a lot that could be done to restore that trust, and we really hope that the Advisory Council Against Economic Crime and Corruption can show the way here. I know they're preparing a major plan to tackle corruption, and hopefully this will contribute to resolving some of these concerns. But they are deeper long-term concerns that have been going on for many years, and we're seeing a drift in that way. Here's some further findings from the survey. 77% of people believe that it's never justifiable to bribe a public official in their course of duties. That's a fairly healthy number. It could be better, but I suppose it reflects that Ireland doesn't have a history of petty corruption these days, where individuals need to pay small bribes to access public services like health and education and so on. That doesn't seem to be the case. When the Irish public talk about corruption, they're talking about something else usually. Another key finding from the survey, people believe by elected party members to declare all assets as required by the law should result in resignation. You know, there are legal weaknesses that need to be addressed here, as we've seen in the news recently, that you know, there are major problems remain about asset disclosure, and there's a lot that we can do to give the standards in public office greater powers and greater resources to really address this particular failure. Further findings then, 84% of voters are less likely to vote for a candidate if corruption was evident in their own constituency. 81% of voters are less likely to vote for a candidate if corruption was evident at the national party level as well. So, you know, people are equally likely to punish corruption, at least that's what they say, you know, at party and individual level. Overall then, you know, more Irish people than not see evidence of corruption in Ireland. They mightn't be able to see petty bribes on a day-to-day basis, but, you know, they are particularly worried that political connections are very important for success in business. They're worried that, you know, political donations have a very significant impact on how decisions are made in Ireland, and they're worried about you know, public appointments and whether or not they're based on merit. They're worried about corruption in the planning system. There's great concern there as well, and that's the kind of thing that isn't captured necessarily by other surveys of attitudes in Ireland. Corruption in the planning system has been a long-term problem here, one that has not necessarily been resolved by the tribunals of previous years. Recently, we've seen that this is continues to be a problem, and on board Pleanála are struggling to reform right now. So I'll wrap up with just some final key findings. There's a lot more in the survey, and I'd encourage you to, you know, download and read the full document. Research will continue into corruption in Ireland. We're hoping to publish our findings and publish more detailed findings on the determinants of all these attitudes in the coming months. So I'll leave it here, and I'll pass things over now to my colleague Robert Gillanders, who will you know, has some concluding remarks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of the implications of these findings as I see them. Thanks, Michael. And while I'm talking, just a reminder that we're more than happy to take any questions you might have about the report or about corruption in general. So you can put them into the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. So I think my colleague Michael has given a really great overview of the report and kind of pointed to the challenges that it poses for Ireland, and they are, I think, significant challenges, because, you know, every country needs to fight corruption, to turn one of our DCU mottos on its head a little bit. You know, DCU, we're all about transforming lives and societies. There's no force in social science that I've seen that has the potential to ruin lives and societies like corruption does. Really is economic and social poison. We know from evidence that it increases infant mortality. More corrupt countries have higher rates of infant mortality, poverty, inequality, and even violence, including some work that we published in the centre earlier this year that showed that corruption leads to higher rates of intimate partner violence. People seem to engage in this despicable act more often in places that are more corrupt. It drives down other indicators of physical health and mental health, and, you know, it maybe least importantly, but very importantly, it damages firm growth and innovation. In countries that have more corruption are less innovative, they grow less economically, they grow less rapidly. And, you know, as a very small open economy, very small, very open economy, we really need to take corruption perception seriously, because another very consistent finding from across social science is that foreign direct investment, like domestic investment, is repelled by corruption. So we really need to take this very, very seriously. Now, part of the fight against corruption is most certainly implementing the kind of reforms that are outlined in the Hamilton report. So we've kind of better resourcing, coordination, and kind of legal and regulatory reform. All these things will make it harder for people to get away with corruption and kind of disincentivize that kind of behavior, make it more likely that they'll be caught. But, if we think of corruption as a war, as I'm prone to doing, in this war, we're not doing great at winning the hearts and minds. And this is something that we need to maybe think a bit more about as a society. As people have said earlier on, there definitely is a potential for a gap between perceptions and reality. By all international metrics, Ireland is a relatively clean country, although we probably could be doing better in our kind of peer group of EU states. But people operate, they make their decisions based on their perceptions and their beliefs. So we really need to get to grips with this. ARC research and research by others has shown that when people believe that their institutions and their leaders are corrupt, it makes it easier for them to do likewise. For example, a paper we published a few years back shows how when leaders are perceived or observed to be corrupt, people just ignore even very strong anti-corruption laws. Kind of corroding legitimacy leads to people not caring what the law says, even if it's a kind of a strong law that has real teeth to it. So corruption can undermine the potency, or beliefs about corruption can undermine the potency of anti-corruption laws. Likewise, tax evasion, and this has been shown across a bunch of different contexts, tax evasion and tax morale, people aren't so keen on paying their taxes when they think that the government is corrupt. Again, whether they think the government's corrupt, this is the thing that drives their behaviors. And one of the really important findings, I think, from the report, and I think everybody pointed to this, is the perceptions about corruption in the planning domain. Well, we know from a lot of research that support for redistributive policies is lower when people think that the system is corrupt. People are less likely to commit their time, resources, and faith to redistributing resources if they think that the game is rigged. And in a time of rising housing inequality, this speaks to a real problem in our ability to solve this problem. People will be less likely to support policies that allow other people to get on the housing ladder and escape from housing poverty if they think that the system is corrupt. I guess in general, my message is we really need to be wary of a kind of a cascade of bad norms, because we know it's much, much easier to become a corrupt country than it is to escape from corruption. Once you start down that path, you quite quickly can fall to the bad equilibrium. And I think that, I think we recognize this in Ireland, the excellent work that James has done in preparing the Hamilton report, and the support of the various departments in the government. It points to that there is an awareness that this is a challenge. And I think that the thing that we need to maybe think about, and this is where universities can play a particular role, is we need to do better on educating the public and public officials, right? So there's a lot of kind of relatively cheap and effective interventions that behavioral economics has pointed to as being effective, triggering norms and strengthening norms by the way you frame information when you send people letters, public meetings, kind of broadly understood. We live in a digital age, so kind of public meetings, not just sitting around together, but having discussions online and kind of talking about these things in an open way, and even more ambitiously, perhaps embedding a kind of an anti-corruption curriculum throughout the school system in Ireland. These are all things that could really work to strengthen our anti-corruption norms and beliefs. A larger challenge, I think, is for political actors and civil servants to maybe more fully realize, because I said, I think it is something that people are aware of, but to more fully realize that they're the custodians of a very valuable and very exhaustible national resource, which is the public trust. When we don't have public trust, it is more difficult for us to do things as a society. And there are short-term expediencies to maybe fudging processes or withholding reports from public consumption. And FOI requests, I suspect, are an awful drain on resources, but not fulfilling them has real long-term consequences in terms of the public's trust and belief. And I think that would be my basic message, that when we have mistrust in government, it just makes it much, much harder for us to do things as a society and solve collective action problems. Daire alluded to some research we did back at the kind of the start of COVID, or relatively early into the pandemic, that showed how in the US, states that had higher rates of corruption had lower rates of compliance with what they called shelter-in-place orders. People didn't trust their government, they didn't listen to the advice, they disregarded it, and people, less compliance with good public health rules will lead to more people dying. So corruption kills trust. By killing trust, it can ultimately kill people and undermine our ability to do things as a society. So they're my thoughts on the implications of the survey. And I think I'll hand back to Michael, and we'll happy take your questions at this point.
Okay, we have a question coming through. Rob, I'll put this one to you. The question is, when was the survey conducted? And were there any particular events that you think affected the outcome of the survey around that time?
Okay, so we conducted this back in, let me try and remember, it was in September, a few months back. So that was when we could. What was the main driver? Well, we felt that there was a gap in our understanding of attitudes to corruption. We do have things like the Corruption Perceptions Index, which tells kind of broad expert perception of corruption about Ireland. The Eurobarometer gets into it a little bit about people's experiences and kind of high-level beliefs about corruption. But we thought that there was a real gap in digging into Ireland-specific issues that we think, as we said, are very important. The other question was, do we think there was anything that might have influenced it? Yeah. So at the time, it was in and around the time when there were questions being asked about asset disclosures by elected officials, and I think that might have influenced potentially the question about should people who fail to declare all assets resign. I think that was a very high yes, an emphatic yes from the Irish people. I see on the screen, is there a plan to repeat the survey over time? Yeah, I think so. There are some questions that I think we really should be tracking. We didn't talk too much about the share of people who think that it might be justifiable to bribe a public official. I worry about that. I know it's low, 7%, I think people said that might be okay. The problem is, as I said, you're on there's kind of a potential for norms to change very quickly and in a direction that we don't want them to change. And I think it would be really important to track that figure over time. So I hope we can run this again next year. And we might change some of the questions, but there's certainly some things that I think we should track for kind of democratic health.
I might put the next question to James Hamilton. James, we have a question, can the public's perception be changed without actual underlying change? For example, through media campaigns or even the work of the Advisory Council Against Economic Crime and Corruption. And I might just sort of add to that, do you think that the council's work will be able to affect positive change here?
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Obviously, if there is a basis for the public concern, then you have to address the underlying problem. And I think that's mainly the concern of the council. If people have what's clearly a wrong perception, then it may be, of course, that an information campaign can deal with that. It's very difficult, quite honestly, to answer a hypothetical question like this, because without looking at a concrete situation, it's very hard to give any answer. So all I can say is, yes, I suppose in principle, it might be possible. But if there is a basis for the public concern, then that's what you have to address. I should add that we're as a council at a very early stage. We're still discussing exactly what the scope of our mandate is and so forth. So I don't want to give the impression that this is the sort of work that we're going to be doing, because you're asking me to go a number of steps down the road on that one, and I'm not simply in a position to do that. So I'm sorry, that sounds like a very cagey sort of answer, but unfortunately, I think without looking at an actual concrete situation, it's very difficult to give an answer to a question like that. It is rather a hypothetical question. So I hope that meets some of the question in any event.
Could I add
yes, very understandable.
Just a thought of my own. Can perceptions be changed without underlying change? I mean, there is an interesting strand of the kind of academic literature that compares and contrasts perceptions about how corrupt a country is with how corrupt firms in particular see it to be. And there can be wide discrepancies between the two. People have pointed to perceptions biases in kind of international rankings of how corrupt a country is. People tend to see an African country or a poor country or countries with other characteristics and kind of impute how corrupt it must be from those things. So, perceptions and reality can be driven by different things. And we know at some level that you can change perceptions without changing the underlying reality, and vice versa. In the Irish case, though, as James says, I think it's something we will have to think more carefully about and go on from there.
Could I give one example which maybe illustrates this? If you look at the Transparency International Corruption Index, and if you go back to the days when we know now that there was very serious corruption in the planning process, the public generally were not as aware of this problem as I think they are now. And I think you'll find that the Corruption Perception Index then was lower than it was immediately after the various inquiries reported and people became aware of it. So that at a stage when almost certainly these problems had been to some extent addressed, and I'm not saying that everything was solved, but certainly at that stage there was a greater degree of awareness of corruption, but probably a lesser degree of corruption, and yet the perception indexes were showing a higher perception of corruption. So there may be an argument, and this is really something for the academic world to look at, not for me, but there may well be an argument that the perception index may follow. It doesn't necessarily follow the level of corruption itself, but it follows what people know about corruption. And of course, all of these indexes also show that the vast majority of people never encounter this. So their knowledge of it is from what they read in the media, what they hear on the news, etc. Unless, for example, you'd been engaged in the planning process, you probably wouldn't be aware of some of the difficulties, although obviously people will sometimes point the finger and say, well, I don't know how that got planning permission. You'll get that sort of gossip going on. But I don't know. The answer really is that the two, they're related, but they're not necessarily a direct relation. Because the problem is, if you were to confine it only to people, not a perception index, but to ask people, have they been asked to pay a bribe? Have they ever paid a bribe? Those sort of questions will maybe measure the extent to which there is corruption. But then, of course, you have a particular problem there in that people who have been involved in corruption may be reluctant to give you an honest answer about it. So I think these are some of the pitfalls. The academics would be much better at explaining all this than I am. But from the point of view of a person looking at it and trying to understand what surveys are telling you, I think these are things that you have to bear in mind.
Yeah, so I might put this next question to both of our speakers. Maybe we'll, Rob, you could perhaps take it on first, and then James. What do you think is the most pressing legal reform needed in the area, and one that would make the biggest difference to fighting corruption in Ireland?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, and again, something we've done a lot of work on in the centre, is the role of press freedom in serving as an effective anti-corruption watchdog. And we're not bad at press freedom in Ireland, but there are obvious issues around the chilling effect that some of our laws have on reporting and discourse. So I would think press freedom reforms along the lines, think of, and I'm no legal expert, I'm only an economist, but I think legal reforms along the lines of what they've done in the UK, where there's kind of minimum harm thresholds, I think they call them, to kind of take some of the people can still have their good name, but there is better scope for the press to function there. I think that's what I would do, where I anti-corruption czar for a day. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Rob. I'll put the same question to James, a sort of a wish list question.
Well, it's very difficult to. I mean, we have had a lot of legal reforms. For example, back at the time when all these various things that were investigated in the Mann Tribunal and the various tribunals, the state of the law which dealt with corruption was in a very poor state, because, for example, if money was paid to a politician, it wasn't enough to show that there was a payment made. You had to also show the purpose for which the payment was made and that something had been granted in return. And of course, corrupt people don't make it all that easy for anyone trying to follow their activities. So essentially, the offence at the time was pretty well unprosecutable. All of that has been reformed. We now have fairly good offences in place, but we have you always have to continue keeping an eye on what's happening, and that involves quite a lot of research. I mean, people who are involved in paying a bribe, they're not going to tell you about it, especially if they've received something in return. Usually when these things come to light, it's because the nature of bribery is one person pays a bribe, another person receives it. They both commit an offence, and so they both have an interest in keeping that quiet, and nobody else will know about it unless, of course, it becomes very obvious in some other way. But usually these things come to light after there's been a falling out between the two parties involved, and one of them decides to tell the truth about it, and usually in an effort to damage the other person. And we've had a number of examples of that, cases where a husband and wife fell out, had a bitter marital dispute, and one of the parties then became an informant about what the other one had been up to, or where two business people fall out, or where there's a political dispute. So we've had examples of that, but unfortunately, you wouldn't learn about that from any corruption survey or the like. So what you have to do is have mechanisms in place to examine what's really going on, to carry out spot checks. There are, for example, ways in which you can look in the procurement area and try to see whether bid rigging is going on. There are now computer programs which can analyze bids and so forth, and can spot patterns and things that are amiss, that sort of thing. You can do spot checks on things. If you're looking at the planning process, you can obviously look at the files of particular individuals in the planning department and check out whether everything is okay, etc. There are a lot of things you can do if you're going to keep an eye on things. If you want to talk in a general term, then of course there are lots of things that need to be done. One, for example, is to review how well is our whistleblower legislation operating. That was very contentious a few years ago, and we brought in new legislation. The time has probably come, I think, to review how that's operating. Is it really working? Is it doing what it was meant to do? There are other areas, for example, conflicts of interest. Do people really understand conflict of interest? Are there strong enough rules to deal with them, etc.? I think that's probably a fairly major area. The survey which you've just heard about today indicates that there's a widespread belief that, I don't want to say corruption, but that there are certain low standards in certain areas, and particularly in the political area. All of that may be misconceived and it may be wrong, but what is needed is to have a very thorough look at what exactly is happening and to be sure, for example, that there are proper conflict of interest rules to ensure that people don't get involved in making decisions which benefit them personally, and that the rules are robust enough to deal with that.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, somebody was just giving me a message there, but there are just a number of things. I can't begin to rank them in my head now. This is something that the Advisory Council will be dealing with, and I'm just one member of it. I'm chairing it, but there are, I think, 15 members or something like that from a wide variety of disciplines, and they are going to have their own different views and their own different experiences and expertise. And there are people who are expert in areas that I know very little about, and then there are other people, there are things I know about that other people may not know about. That's the whole idea of a council. So I can't predict what's going to come out of it, but the intention is that we will look at a very wide range of things. And at the moment, one of the tasks we have is to look at precisely what our scope is and what other issues we should look at, apart from the matters which were considered in the report, which I was already involved in producing the last year and in the years before that. So I'm sorry, again, that sounds like not answering the question, but it isn't possible to give just one simple answer to it. I don't think there's just one area that needs to be looked at. There are a range of things that really need to be reviewed and thought about.
So we have two more questions, and I think they might both be good for Rob. The first one is from Alicia Zaykova. Are there any measures offered to officials to make the corruption level lower? And then, yeah, so you might want to deal with that one first, Rob, and then I can tell you the other one.
Sure. I mean, are there any kind of concrete measures offered to officials to make the lower? When I think about a question, it reminds me, once upon a time, I was on a train to an airport from Brussels with an anti-corruption expert from I won't name the Scandinavian country, but we were chatting about a report we were going to write, and he was quite worried because he said, we don't really have many strong anti-corruption laws in my country. I don't know what I'm going to write about. And I mean, to me, that's really shows that one of the key things that can keep officials from engaging in corruption is the norm. That beliefs and norms about how we should behave, but even more importantly about how other people behave, is really a part of our anti-corruption defense system that we can't do without. We need really strong laws for sure. We need reforms, but really, I think what keeps most people from doing bad things is a strong norm. So I think that's the thing that makes corruption levels low in places like Ireland and in Scandinavian countries and so on. Just that sense, that belief that it's unthinkable that we would do it, for most people at least. So I don't know if that's a concrete enough example, but I think that is a very important part of that system.
I would completely endorse that. I would prefer to talk about the culture of various occupations, but I think it's the same thing that Bob is talking about. I mean, for example, I worked for many years in the Attorney General's office, and I knew civil servants in Ireland very well and how they operate. And the one thing I would say is that they are, by and large, extremely honest, not corrupt. The idea of taking a bribe would be unthinkable for the vast majority of them. The examples where we've had where there was bribery, there have been some, but they've all been at a very low level. People who were essentially dealing with issuing of licenses or the like, and they've been very few and far between. I do remember one or two in particular, but they're extremely rare. You would get the same in some of the professions, and I can only speak I know. But again, with most barristers, dealing with each other. Again, the idea of taking a bribe or anything of that sort would be absolutely unthinkable. The same with the judiciary. And we do have that advantage, I think, that there are these very strong cultures, and people don't act that way, because if you did something like that and were found, it would be something very, very shameful. And you very often find, and the same thing in Scandinavia, that countries which have a lower problem don't have as much legislation. The countries which have a lot of legislation, it's very often because there is a major problem. Now, I'm not saying any of that to minimize the fact, the problems which do exist, and the fact that there is corruption in places, but it is a great benefit that we start from a population where, by and large, corruption is not accepted. It is not the norm in Ireland to pay bribes. Most people would be, I think, horrified if they were asked to pay a bribe, and I think we want to keep it that way. And that, I think, is where the culture comes in, and where people's behaviour and what they see as a norm is very important. So it's essential that we work from that and make sure that we don't lose any of those advantages.
Thanks, James. I think that's probably not a bad place to conclude with the time. Our norms are important. We're lucky to have strong cultures against corruption. But the report points to challenges, I think, in preserving those norms and cultures and strengthening them.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to all our attendees and our distinguished speakers. Really look forward to future work in this space. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.